At 72, Gideon Mercer thought his son was taking him to the mountains to mend their estrangement. But when the truck disappears into a blizzard, leaving him alone in a cold, deserted shack without food or phone signal, he learns the bitter truth. The son he had risked his life to protect is now waiting for him to die. This story will take you on a breathtaking journey of survival, betrayal, and justice. Please like and comment the city you're watching in to let me know how far the story has progressed. Start now. I used to believe that loyalty was something you earned by giving everything you had. I gave Logan everything. And on the coldest night of my life, parked in front of a cabin that looked like it hadn't seen another living soul in a decade, I finally understood what that kind of giving actually costs a man. Let me back up. My name is Gideon Mercer. I was 72 years old when my son drove me into the mountains to die. And the worst part isn't the cold or the hunger or the silence that swallowed me whole for 3 months. The worst part is that I got into that truck smiling. I remember the smell of the leather seats, brand new, still had that plastic and chemical scent that meant Logan had just bought it. I remember thinking, good, the boy's doing well for himself. I remember being proud. "You're gonna love this place, Dad," Logan said, both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road like he was concentrating real hard on something. "Just you and me. No distractions. No Sherry calling every 5 minutes about the wedding budget. Just us, like the old days." The old days. He said that like he remembered them the way I did. Fishing trips out at Cobb Lake, me teaching him how to gut a trout without losing his lunch, him falling asleep against my shoulder in the truck on the ride home. I held on to those memories so tight that I didn't see what was sitting right in front of me the whole drive up. I should tell you a little about who I was before all this, because the man freezing in that truck wasn't always weak. I built Mercer Hardware from a single rented storefront in 1979 into 4 locations across the county. I buried my wife, Eleanor, 12 years ago, and I never once complained about doing the rest of my life alone, because complaining wasn't something Eleanor raised me to do, and grief wasn't something I let myself wallow in past the first year. I worked. I provided. When Logan came to me 8 months before that drive and said he wanted to expand his contracting business, I didn't blink before writing the check. $41,000. I didn't even ask him to put it on paper. He was my son. "Don't you trust me, Dad?" he'd said, almost hurt that I'd hesitated for even a second on the wording of it. "Of course I trust you," I told him. And I meant it. God help me. I meant it with my whole chest. That trust is what got me into that truck. That trust is what made me not notice when Logan got cagey 3 weeks before the trip, taking phone calls outside on the porch where I couldn't hear, talking low and fast to someone he never named. That trust is what made me sign whatever stack of papers he slid in front of me one evening, telling me it was just routine, Dad, updating your power of attorney in case anything ever happens to you. You know, for emergencies. I signed it without my readers on. I signed it because my son asked me to. We'd been driving almost 6 hours when the paved roads turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to something barely deserving the name road at all. Pine trees pressed in close on both sides, heavy with snow, and the GPS on Logan's dashboard had lost signal a good 40 minutes back. "We're getting pretty deep in here, son," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "You sure this cabin's got heat? Power?" "It's rustic, Dad. That's the whole point. Unplug for a while." He smiled at me sideways, and something about that smile didn't reach his eyes the way it used to when he was a boy. I told myself it was just the bad lighting. I told myself a lot of things that day. The cabin, when we finally reached it, looked like something out of an old photograph. Gray, slumped, half its roof caved under years of snow load, windows fogged with grime on the inside. My stomach dropped the second I saw it, but I didn't say anything, because saying something meant admitting I was scared, and Mercer men don't admit they're scared. That's a lesson my own father beat into me, and I'd apparently passed it down whole like a family heirloom nobody asked for. "This is it?" I asked anyway, because some fear refuses to stay quiet no matter how hard you press it down. "Home base for the week," Logan said, already climbing out, breath fogging in front of his face. "Come on, let's get the bags." There was one bag. Mine. A single duffel that Logan had packed for me back at the house, insisting he knew exactly what I'd need and there was no point in me fussing over it. I thought that was sweet at the time. Thoughtful. my boy taking care of his old man. Inside, the cabin was worse than the outside promised. A wood stove sat cold in the corner, rusted at the seams. There was no electricity, no running water that I could find, and when I flipped the small flashlight from my coat pocket, my own flashlight, thank God, the one thing of mine Logan hadn't thought to help me pack, across the pantry shelves, I found exactly 4 cans of beans, a half-empty bag of rice, and a box of matches that felt suspiciously light when I shook it. Logan, my voice came out steadier than I felt. Where's the rest of the supplies? He was standing in the doorway, backlit by the gray afternoon, and for the first time since we'd left home, he wasn't smiling. I'll bring more up tomorrow, he said. Got a few things to sort out in town first. Town's 6 hours back the way we came. There's a closer route. I know these roads, Dad. I used to come up here with friends back in college. A pause, just a half-second too long. I'll be back before dark. I want to tell you I had some kind of premonition right then, some gut instinct that screamed at me to grab my keys and walk out that door behind him. But the truth is, I trusted him so completely that even watching him climb back into that brand new truck, even watching him not look back at me once through the windshield, I still raised my hand and waved. He didn't wave back. The truck's engine faded into the trees and then there was nothing. No engine, no birds. They don't sing much in that kind of cold. No wind even, in that first hour, just a stillness so total I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I told myself he'd be back the next morning. I built up the wood stove with what dry kindling I could find stacked under the porch eave, rationed myself half a can of beans, and slept in my coat on a cot that smelled like mouse droppings and old canvas. He wasn't back the next morning. He wasn't back the morning after that either. By the 4th day, the last of the matches gone, and the wood stove barely holding a flame on green pine. I'd hacked off a fallen branch with a hatchet I found rusting in the woodshed. I finally let myself say the word I'd been avoiding since that truck disappeared into the white horizon. Abandoned. My own son had driven me 4 hours into nowhere, left me with 4 cans of beans and a duffel bag of summer clothes. I found out later he'd packed it deliberately wrong, 2 t-shirts and a windbreaker for a mountain winter, and driven away without so much as a backward glance. I sat by that dying fire on the 4th night, 72 years old, hands shaking from cold and from something worse than cold, and I made myself ask the question I didn't want answered. Why? The answer came to me slow, the way the worst truths always do, piece by piece, like a man picking gravel out of a wound. The power of attorney papers, the calls on the porch, the new truck Logan couldn't have afforded on a struggling contracting business, not unless that $41,000 had gone somewhere else entirely. The way he'd looked at me in the doorway of that cabin, not like a son looking at his father, but like a man finishing a job he didn't enjoy but needed done. He hadn't brought me here to reconnect. He'd brought me here to disappear. I don't know how long I sat with that realization before the anger finally cracked through the grief. Because for a man my age, in a cabin like that, grief is a luxury you can't afford for long. The cold doesn't wait for you to finish feeling sorry for yourself. The cold is patient, and it is cruel, and it does not care how betrayed you feel. I'd buried a wife. I'd built a business out of nothing but stubbornness and bad coffee. I was not going to let my own son finish what nobody else in 72 hard years had managed to do. On the 5th morning, I made a decision that probably saved my life, though it didn't feel like wisdom at the time. It felt like rage with nowhere else to go. I stopped waiting for that truck to come back up the road. I started preparing like it never would. I went through every inch of that cabin with my flashlight, cataloging what I had. A hatchet, dull but workable. A rusted set of wire snares hanging in the woodshed, left behind by God knows who. A single cast iron skillet. A cracked window I could patch with the cardboard from the bean cans and what was left of an old tarp. It wasn't much. It wasn't close to enough. But it was something, and something was more than what Logan had left me to believe I had. That first week taught me more about survival than 70 years of comfortable living ever had. I learned that hunger isn't really about your stomach. It's about your mind. The way it starts negotiating with you, telling you things will be fine if you just lie down and rest a while longer than you should. I learned that the body can do remarkable things when you stop giving it permission to quit. I set those old snares the way I half remembered from boyhood hunting trips with my own father, and on the seventh day I caught a rabbit, and I won't pretend that the sound it made didn't haunt me, because it did, and it still does some nights. But I ate that night for the first time in 2 days, and I cried while I did it, not from sadness anymore, but from something closer to fury. I started talking to myself out loud, just to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. "You are not going to die in this cabin," I told the empty room. "You are not going to give him that." It became something like a prayer, except I'd lost any taste for prayer years before, somewhere around the time Eleanor's casket went into the ground and the world kept right on turning like it hadn't lost anything at all. So instead, it became a vow. A promise to myself, made out loud to four cold walls and a dying fire, repeated every single morning like a man clocking into a job he refused to abandon. I am not going to die in this cabin. By the second week, I'd reinforced the broken window with branches lashed together and the remnants of the tarp, stuffed every gap I could find with dried moss and pine needles, and built the fire up high enough each night that I could sleep without waking every 20 minutes shivering. I was thinner. My hands had cracked and bled from the cold and the work, and I'd started talking to a photograph of Eleanor I kept in my coat pocket, like she could actually hear me, which I suppose, in some sense, I wasn't ready to examine too closely. I believed she could. "You'd be furious with him," I told her photograph one night, the fire popping low beside me. "You always said that boy had your mother's temper and my blindness. Guess you were right on both counts." It was during the third week, half starved and half frozen and pushing myself farther from the cabin than I ever had before in search of better firewood, that I found the second set of footprints in the snow. Small, careful, deliberately placed to avoid an obvious trail. Not Logan's. Not anyone coming up the road I'd memorized every curve and dip of. Someone else was out here. And for the first time in 21 days, the fury that had been keeping me alive made room for something else entirely. Something I hadn't let myself feel since that truck disappeared into the white horizon. Hope. I followed those footprints with my hatchet gripped tight in my cracked, bleeding hand, every instinct in my old body torn between two opposite fears. The fear of being alone out here forever, and the fear of finally not being alone. The tracks wound through a stand of birch trees, careful, deliberate, the kind of walking pattern that told me whoever made them knew exactly how to avoid leaving an obvious trail. That scared me more than if they'd been careless. A careless person was lost. A careful person was hiding. I almost turned back twice. My legs were shaking from 3 weeks of half rations, and some small, sane part of my brain kept telling me that whoever was out here might not be friendly, might see a starving old man as an easy thing to take advantage of, rather than someone worth helping. But I'd made a vow to that cold cabin and to Eleanor's photograph, and turning back without answers felt like a kind of surrender I wasn't ready to commit to. The tracks led me to a rock outcropping I hadn't explored yet, maybe 2 miles from my cabin, where a thin curl of smoke rose gray against the white sky. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant a person who'd figured out how to survive longer than I had. I approached slow, announcing myself the way you'd announce yourself to a spooked animal, hands visible, voice low. "Hello? I mean, you no harm. I'm just looking for help." The cave entrance, half hidden behind a fall of dead brush, went silent for a long moment. Then a voice came back, flat and wary. A woman's voice, rough at the edges like she hadn't used it on another human being in some time. "Stay where you are." I stayed. She emerged slowly from behind that brush, and my first thought was that she looked like the mountain itself had made her. Weathered, lean, dressed in layers of mismatched clothing that had clearly been adapted and repaired by hand over a long stretch of time. She was maybe 55, hard eyes, a hunting knife held loose but ready at her side. "You're not Forest Service," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am. Name's Gideon Mercer. I've been—" My voice cracked, embarrassingly, and I had to start over. "I've been stuck up here 3 weeks. My son left me. I don't have much left." Something shifted in her face when I said that. Not softness, exactly. Recognition. "Marla," she said after a moment, like the name cost her something to give up. "Marla Hayes. You said your son left you. Drove me up here, told me it was a trip to reconnect. Took my $41,000 before he did it, and most of my savings besides. Left me 4 cans of beans and a bag of summer clothes for a mountain winter. I heard my own voice go bitter, and I didn't try to hide it. Guess he figured the mountain would finish the job so he wouldn't have to. Marla studied me for a long moment, knife still loose in her hand, before something in her posture finally eased. "Come inside before you freeze talking about it," she said. "I've got coffee. Real coffee, not the instant garbage." I want to tell you that cave felt like salvation, and in a way it did, but I should be honest with you the way I've tried to be honest through this whole telling. I was suspicious of her too, at first. 3 weeks alone teaches you not to trust easy kindness, especially not from a stranger living off-grid in a cave with a hunting knife and eyes that had clearly seen things she didn't care to discuss. I drank her coffee with my back to the cave wall, watching her the way she was watching me, two wounded animals circling each other's intentions. "You're a medic," I said eventually, noticing the careful, practiced way she'd glanced at my cracked, bleeding hands when I first sat down, the assessment in her eyes that wasn't quite curiosity. "Or you were." "Wilderness medic, 22 years. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, not that first day. We were both still deciding whether the other one was worth the risk of trusting. It took her 3 more visits before she told me why she was out here, hiding in a cave with enough supplies to last a careful person through winter, 4 hours from the nearest town by truck and farther than that on foot. "My husband," she said one evening, staring into the small fire she kept far better tended than my own, "decided 22 years of marriage meant he had a right to control every dollar I earned, every decision I made, right down to which doctor I was allowed to see. I left with what I could carry. Spent 8 months in shelters before I figured out the system was just as willing to fail me as he was. So I came up here instead, built something he couldn't take from me." "And nobody's looking for you?" She laughed, short and humorless. 46-year-old woman who left a respected county judge? Sweetheart, everybody believed him when he said I'd had a breakdown and wandered off. Nobody comes looking for crazy. I sat with that for a long moment, the parallels settling into my chest like a stone. 2 people the world had written off. Me as a wandering old fool who'd gotten himself lost. Her as a broken woman who'd lost her grip on reality. Both of us, in truth, victims of people who'd decided our dignity was less important than what they could take from us. "He convinced people you were crazy so nobody would believe you if you ever did come back," I said slowly. "And your son's probably already telling people the same thing about you." Confused old man wandered off into the mountains. Tragic, but expected, given his age. She looked at me with something that might have been pity. If pity weren't a thing she'd clearly trained herself out of feeling for survival's sake. "That's how it works, Gideon. They don't just take your money. They take your credibility first, so that when you try to tell the truth, nobody's listening." That conversation changed something fundamental in how I understood what had happened to me. I'd been thinking about survival in terms of firewood and rabbit snares, and getting through one more freezing night. Marla made me understand that surviving the mountain wasn't actually the hard part of what was coming. Surviving Logan's version of the story, that was going to be the real fight. Over the following weeks, our 2 camps became one operation, out of necessity more than easy friendship at first. Marla had skills I desperately needed. She knew how to set snares that actually worked more often than mine did. How to identify which bark and roots held nutrition. How to read the sky for the blizzards before they hit, so we could prepare instead of simply endure. I had something to offer too, even half-starved and old. 72 years of stubbornness, and a mind that once it stopped grieving and started planning, turned out to still work as sharp as it ever had in my hardware business. "You ran 4 stores," Marla said one night, genuinely surprised, after I'd explained how I'd restructured our supply rationing using a system not far off from inventory management. "From 1 storefront to 4, that's not luck. That's a man who understands systems." "Wasn't luck," I agreed. "Hardest thing I ever did before this mountain, and I thought I'd never have to work that hard again at my age." I poked at the fire, watching sparks lift toward the cave's low ceiling. "Funny thing is, I gave Logan every chance to learn that same discipline. Tried to teach him the business when he was younger. He always wanted the shortcut, wanted the money without the building of it." "That's not your failure, Gideon." Marla's voice was firm, almost sharp, the wilderness medic in her surfacing through the conversation like she was treating a wound she could see, but I couldn't. You can hand a man every tool in the world, whether he uses them to build something or to take something that isn't his. That's on him, not you. I didn't believe her, not fully, not that night. Some part of me still carried the old guilt, the question every parent of a child who goes wrong eventually asks themselves in the dark. What did I do? Where did I fail him? What could I have given him that I didn't? It would take weeks more, and a great deal more of Marla's blunt, hard-won wisdom, before I started to separate my son's choices from my own worth as a father. The blizzards, when they came hard. There was a stretch in what I guessed was early February. We'd long since lost any reliable way to track the actual date, where the snow fell so thick and so constant that neither of us left our shelters for 4 straight days. I spent those days alone in my reinforced cabin, the wind screaming against the patched window like something alive and furious. And I'll admit to you now, the way I haven't admitted to anyone since, that there were hours in that storm where I thought about simply letting the fire go out, where the cold started to feel less like an enemy and more like an invitation to finally stop fighting. What kept me going wasn't pride, not in that moment. It was rage, clean and pure as anything I'd ever felt. I thought about Logan in whatever warm house my stolen money had bought him, probably telling Sherry some sanitized version of how his poor confused father had wandered off and there was nothing to be done about it now. So tragic, really. Best to focus on moving forward. I thought about him filing whatever paperwork he needed to file to make sure my remaining accounts, my house, everything Eleanor and I had built together over 40 years of marriage, ended up exactly where he wanted it. You don't get to have it, I said out loud to that empty, howling cabin, my voice raw. You don't get to take everything and still get to call yourself my son when people ask what happened to me. I won't let you have that story. I built the fire back up. I survived the storm. When the snow finally cleared enough for me to make the trek to Marla's cave, I found her sitting outside despite the lingering cold, staring at something in her weathered hands. A small, worn photograph, edges soft with handling. My daughter, she said before I could ask. 18 when I left. She's 26 now. I don't know if she believes the things her father told her about me, or if she's spent 8 years wondering why her mother never came back for her. Her voice cracked, just slightly, the first real crack I'd seen in her since I'd met her. That's the part nobody warns you about, when you escape something that's killing you. You don't just lose the person who hurt you. Sometimes you lose everyone who believed them over you. I sat down beside her in the snow, my old knees screaming in protest, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. We're going to get off this mountain, I said finally. Both of us. And when we do, we're not going to let anyone's lies stand. Not Logan's, not your husband's. That's a nice speech for a man who can't even feel his own toes right now, she said. But there was the ghost of something warmer in her voice than I'd heard from her before. I built a business out of nothing but stubbornness, Marla. I think I've got one more hard climb left in me. I meant it as encouragement, mostly for myself as much as for her, but saying it out loud in that cold, bright air felt like the first true plan I'd made since that truck disappeared into the white horizon. We started, after that, actually preparing to leave the mountain rather than simply surviving on it. It was slower work than either of us wanted because leaving meant more than just walking. It meant building strength back into bodies that had been living on rationed beans, rabbit meat, and bark tea for months. It meant Marla teaching me which direction held the nearest ranger station, roughly 14 miles southeast by her best calculation, based on landmarks she'd noted during her own scouting trips over the past 2 years. It also meant, for the first time since I'd arrived at that cabin, allowing myself to think seriously about what waited for me on the other side of the snow line. Not just Logan's betrayal, but the practical, ugly reality of it. The bank accounts he'd likely drained further in my absence. The legal authority that power of attorney document probably gave him over what remained. The version of events he'd no doubt already constructed and fed to friends, neighbors, maybe even the police. He's going to have an answer for everything, I said one night, working through it out loud the way I used to work through inventory problems at the store, talking myself into solutions. Whatever I say, he's going to have some story ready. I need proof. Something he can't argue his way around. Bank records, Marla said immediately. If he transferred money, there's a paper trail, no matter how careful he thinks he was. People like that, and I knew plenty married to a judge, they always think they're smarter than the system. They never are, not completely. I don't know how to access bank records without showing up to a bank in person, and the second I do that, word gets back to him before I'm ready. Then you go to someone who knows how to pull threads quietly, a lawyer, maybe an accountant who specializes in exactly this kind of family theft. Marla's eyes had taken on a sharper focus than I'd seen in her before, the wilderness medic giving way to someone who'd clearly done her own homework on legal systems during her years hiding from her husband. There are people who handle elder financial abuse specifically, Gideon. It happens more than you'd think. You won't be the first case they've seen, and that works in your favor. They'll know exactly what kind of trail to look for. The phrase sat heavy in my chest. Elder financial abuse. I hadn't let myself use those words yet, even in my own head, because using them meant fully accepting what they implied. That my own son had looked at me, his aging father, and seen not a man to protect but a target, an opportunity, a problem to be managed and disposed of. I keep thinking there has to be some explanation, I admitted quietly. Some version of this where he panicked, made a mistake, didn't actually mean for me to... Gideon? Marla's voice cut through, gentle but unrelenting. He packed you summer clothes for a mountain winter. He gave you 4 days of food for a trip he told you would be a week. He took your power of attorney before he did it. That's not panic, that's planning. I sat with the truth of that for a long while, watching the fire burn down low between us, and somewhere in that silence, the last soft, hopeful part of me that had been making excuses for my son finally went quiet. Not gone. I don't think a parent's love for a child ever fully dies, no matter what that child does. But quiet enough, finally, that the rage and the clarity could take its place at the front of my mind, where they needed to be if I was going to survive what came next. We left the mountain on what Marla guessed was the 18th of March, both of us thinner and harder than the people we'd been when we found each other, both of us carrying very different wounds toward the same destination, civilization and the reckoning waiting for us there. The 14 miles took us 3 days, slow and careful, rationing what little we had left and stopping whenever my old legs simply refused to carry me another mile without rest. Marla never once complained about the pace, never once suggested leaving me behind to make better time, and that quiet, unglamorous loyalty taught me more about what real family looked like than 72 years of biological obligation ever had. On the second night of that final trek, huddled close to a small fire in a rock shelter Marla had used before, I asked her something that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. Why'd you help me? That first day. You could have just stayed hidden. Easier for you, probably, to keep your camp secret. She was quiet for a long moment, turning a stick over in the fire. Because nobody helped me, she said finally. 8 months in shelters, telling my story to people who looked at me like I was the crazy one. Like my husband's version of events was obviously more credible than mine, because he had a badge of authority, and I just had bruises and a broken trust. Nobody believed me enough to actually help. Not really, not until I stopped waiting for it and built something myself. She looked at me across the fire, something fierce and certain in her expression. I wasn't going to do that to you. Old man stumbling around these mountains, clearly abandoned by someone who should have protected him. I've seen enough of that story already. Wasn't going to add to it by turning you away. I didn't have words adequate to that, so I didn't try to find any. I just nodded, and we sat together in the firelight, 2 people the world had quietly written off, both of us still very much alive and very much done being quiet about it. We reached the edge of the ranger station access road on the 3rd day, our legs shaking, our bodies running on nothing but willpower and the particular kind of momentum that comes from finally, seeing an end to something you weren't sure you'd survive. And it was there, standing at the tree line looking down at a paved road for the first time in 3 months, that Marla stopped suddenly, gripping my arm. Gideon. Her voice had gone tight, urgent. That's not a ranger truck. I followed her gaze to the vehicle parked at the small station below, half hidden behind the building, and felt my entire body go cold in a way 3 months of mountain winter never quite managed. It was Logan's truck, reconciled template, length conflict, opted for extended narrative composition. Marla's grip on my arm tightened to the point of pain, but I barely felt it. I was staring down at that truck, Logan's truck, the same brand new vehicle that had carried me up into these mountains with promises of reconnection, parked behind the ranger station like something hiding rather than something visiting. Could be a different truck, I said, though I didn't believe it even as the words left my mouth. Lots of people drive that model. Same plate, Gideon. I memorized it the day he dropped you off in case I ever needed it. Marla's voice had gone flat and tactical, the wilderness medic giving way to something harder, more calculating. I followed your tracks back to the cabin that first week before I made contact. I wanted to know what I was dealing with before I introduced myself to a stranger in the middle of nowhere. I should have been unsettled by that, I suppose, the idea that she'd been watching me before she'd ever spoken a word. But 3 months on that mountain had taught me that caution wasn't cruelty, it was survival. And in this particular moment, her caution might have just saved us both from walking blind into whatever Logan was doing at that ranger station. Why would he be here? I asked, though the answer was already forming in my gut, cold and sour. If he thought I was dead... Maybe he's making sure of it, Marla said quietly. Closing the loop, filing paperwork, declaring you officially missing or deceased, whatever he needs to do to finalize his claim on what's left of your estate. People like that don't leave things to chance forever, Gideon. Eventually, they need it official. We pulled back into the tree line, crouched low, watching. I could see Logan through the station's front window now, animated, gesturing, talking to a ranger I didn't recognize. He looked good, healthy, rested, wearing a coat that probably cost more than the entire stack of beans that had kept me alive for 3 months. The rage that climbed up my throat in that moment was unlike anything I'd felt in 72 years of living, including the worst of it during those blizzard nights when I'd thought about simply letting the fire die. This wasn't despair. This was something cleaner, sharper, almost clarifying in its intensity. I want to walk down there right now, I said through clenched teeth, and watch his face when he realizes I'm not dead. And then what? Marla's hand was still on my arm, holding me back with surprising strength for a woman who'd been rationing food same as me for months. He sees you, he panics, he says something to that ranger that makes you sound exactly like the confused old man he's already painted you as. You walk down there now, hungry, exhausted, looking half out of your mind from 3 months in the wild, and you hand him every excuse he needs. She was right, in some part of me, the part that had run a hardware business for 40 years and understood that emotion without strategy was just noise, knew she was right, even through the fury. I forced myself to breathe, to think instead of react, the way I'd had to think instead of react every single day on that mountain just to survive it. Then what do? We wait, we watch, and we figure out exactly what he's telling that ranger, because whatever it is, that's going to be the foundation of whatever story he's built since he left you up there. Marla's eyes were sharp, focused. If we know his story before we confront him, we can dismantle it instead of just contradicting it. There's a difference, and it matters more than you'd think. We waited nearly 2 hours in that tree line, cold seeping back into my bones despite 3 months of acclimating to it, watching Logan's animated gestures through that window, watching him shake the ranger's hand at one point like they'd just concluded some kind of business arrangement. When he finally climbed back into his truck and drove off down the access road, I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly, enough room to breathe again. We approached the ranger station 40 minutes later, after we were certain Logan was well and truly gone. And I'll tell you, walking up to that front door felt harder than anything the mountain had thrown at me. 3 months of rage and grief and survival had built up inside me like pressure in a sealed container, and I had no idea what was going to happen when I finally let some of it out into the world. The ranger, a younger man, maybe 40, with a name tag that read Officer Dale Preston, looked up from his desk when the door opened, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw us standing there was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Confusion first, then a kind of dawning horror as he took in our gaunt faces, our patched, filthy clothing, the unmistakable look of 2 people who'd been fighting for their lives in the wilderness for far longer than any reasonable person should have to. "Sir," he said slowly, standing up from his desk, "are you both all right? Do you need medical attention?" My name is Gideon Mercer, I said, and my voice cracked on the words, 3 months of exhaustion finally catching up to me all at once, now that I'd reached somewhere I could actually let it show. I believe my son was just in here. Logan Mercer. The ranger's face went through several rapid transformations. Recognition, confusion, and then something that looked uncomfortably close to pity, the same pity Marla had warned me about. The look of someone who'd already absorbed a particular version of my story and was struggling to reconcile it with the very alive man standing in front of him. Mr. Mercer, he said carefully, your son filed a missing persons report on you 4 weeks ago. He told us you'd wandered off from a cabin, that you'd been struggling with some confusion lately, some memory issues. We've had 2 search teams out looking for you since then. We were... He paused, clearly recalibrating the sentence he'd been about to say. We were not optimistic, sir, given the time elapsed and the conditions up there. There it was. Confirmation of everything Marla had predicted, laid out in plain official language. Confused old man, memory issues, wandered off. Logan hadn't just abandoned me. He'd preemptively constructed the entire narrative that would explain my death before it even happened. A story so neat and tragic and plausible that no one, not a ranger, not a friend, not a single soul in our hometown, would think to question it. I didn't wander off, I said, and I heard my own voice shaking, not from weakness, but from the sheer effort of staying controlled instead of erupting. My son drove me up to that cabin himself, left me there with 4 days of food and summer clothes for a mountain winter. Took $41,000 from me 8 months before that, and I have every reason to believe he's taken considerably more since. Officer Preston's expression shifted again, the pity giving way to something more careful, more professional. He glanced at Marla, then back at me. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Mercer. It's the truth, Marla said, stepping forward, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 22 years assessing crisis situations under pressure. I'm Marla Hayes, formerly a wilderness medic with the County Search and Rescue Division. I found Mr. Mercer 3 weeks into his abandonment, severely malnourished, with frostbite damage to his hands, surviving on rationed beans and whatever small game he could trap. I can give you a full medical assessment of his condition when we found him versus now, and it will corroborate every word he's telling you. I watched Officer Preston's face as he processed this, as the comfortable, tragic story he'd been told 4 weeks ago started to crack under the weight of 2 living witnesses standing in his office, one of them a trained medical professional with no obvious motive to lie. I need you both to sit down, he said finally, reaching for a notepad. I need to take a full statement, and Mr. Mercer, he paused, looking at me with something that had finally shifted fully into the right kind of concern. I think we need to get you to a hospital first. You're showing visible signs of malnutrition and exposure. The statement can wait an hour. I refused the hospital trip at first, too consumed with the need to get my story on record before Logan had any chance to construct a new layer of lies around the old ones. But Marla, in her steady, practical way, insisted, reminding me that a man who collapsed from exhaustion in the middle of giving his statement wasn't doing himself any favors either. We compromised. A brief medical evaluation at the small clinic attached to the ranger station, followed immediately by a full statement, recorded and witnessed. The doctor who examined me, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Reyes, who'd clearly seen her share of mountain rescue cases, documented everything with the careful, dispassionate thoroughness of someone building a record that might matter later. Frostbite damage to 3 fingers on my left hand. Significant weight loss. I'd find out later I'd dropped nearly 40 pounds. Evidence of malnutrition consistent with months, not weeks, of severely restricted food intake. This isn't what someone looks like after wandering off for a few confused days, Mr. Mercer, she said quietly, making a note on her chart. This is what someone looks like after surviving an extended period of deliberate abandonment in hostile conditions. Hearing a medical professional say it out loud, stripped of any emotion or family loyalty, somehow made it more real than even living through it had. I'd known, of course. I'd known every freezing night, every desperate hour spent hacking at green pine for kindling, every moment I'd talked to Eleanor's photograph just to hear something resembling a human voice. But there's a particular kind of validation that comes from someone with no stake in your story, confirming, in clinical, factual terms, that what happened to you was real and was wrong and wasn't some confused old man's exaggeration of an unfortunate accident. I gave my statement that afternoon, Officer Preston recording every detail, while another officer took Marla's corroborating account in a separate room. The two of us deliberately kept apart so our stories couldn't be accused of being coordinated after the fact. I told them about the power of attorney papers I'd signed without my reading glasses, about the $41,000, about the new truck Logan couldn't have afforded on his actual business income, about the porch phone calls he'd taken 3 weeks before our trip, low and secretive, to someone he never named. "We're going to need to look into his financial records," Officer Preston said when I'd finished, his earlier caution fully replaced now with the focused energy of an investigator who'd just realized his missing persons case had transformed into something far more serious. "Given what you're describing, this isn't just abandonment. This could constitute elder financial abuse and attempted, possibly even premeditated, endangerment. We're going to need a forensic accountant to trace where that money actually went." The words landed in my chest with strange, complicated weight. Part of me had wanted, on some level, an explanation that didn't require those particular labels. Some version of events where Logan had panicked, made a series of terrible decisions in a moment of weakness, and could still, somehow, be redeemed in my understanding of him. Marla had warned me weeks ago, sitting by her fire in that cave, that I needed to fully accept what those words meant before I could effectively fight back against them. Hearing Officer Preston use them so casually, so professionally, finally closed that last small door of denial I hadn't even realized I was still holding open. My son hadn't made a mistake. My son had committed a crime against me, calculated and deliberate, and the law was now prepared to treat it as exactly that. We stayed 2 more nights at a small inn near the ranger station, Marla and I, both of us still too weak and too exhausted to immediately push back toward home, both of us processing the strange, disorienting transition from raw survival to something that resembled civilization again. I remember sitting in that inn's small dining room on the second night, eating a meal that wasn't beans or rabbit for the first time in 3 months, and feeling almost guilty about how much I enjoyed it, like pleasure itself had become something I'd forgotten I was allowed. "You're quiet," Marla observed, watching me push eggs around my plate. "Thinking about what happens when I actually have to face him," I admitted. "Not the legal part, the other part. The part where I have to look my son in the eye and understand that he genuinely wanted me dead." Marla set down her fork, her expression softening in the way it rarely did, the wilderness medic giving way, just briefly, to simple human compassion. "You don't owe him understanding, Gideon. You don't owe him a search for some redeeming explanation that makes this easier for you to live with. Some people just decide that other people, even their own parents, are obstacles between them and what they want. That's not a tragedy that happened to him. That's a choice he made, over and over again, every single day he didn't come back for you." "I keep thinking about Eleanor," I said quietly. "What she'd say if she could see what he became. We raised him together, the two of us. I keep wondering if I missed something, some moment where I could have—" "Stop!" Marla's voice was firm, almost sharp. "I've watched you survive 3 months of conditions that would have broken most men half your age. I've watched you problem solve, adapt, refuse to quit even when quitting would have been so much easier. That's the man who raised Logan. Whatever made your son choose what he chose, it didn't come from a failure of effort on your part. Some people are simply willing to do terrible things, and no amount of good parenting fully inoculates against that." I wanted to believe her completely. I think, looking back now, it took me considerably longer than that dinner conversation to actually let go of the guilt. The way a parent's guilt rarely dissolves all at once, no matter how clearly someone else lays out the truth for you. But her words planted something that night, a seed that would grow stronger over the following weeks, as the legal process unfolded and the full scope of Logan's deception became clear. It was 3 days later, back in town, staying temporarily with an old business associate of mine named Walter Briggs, who'd nearly fainted when I called him from the inn's landline, that I finally agreed to meet with an attorney officer Preston had recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Castellanos, who specialized in exactly the kind of elder financial abuse case I'd unknowingly become the center of. "Mr. Mercer," she said, after I'd laid out everything I knew across her conference table. Based on what you're telling me and what the ranger station's preliminary findings suggest, I think we're looking at something considerably larger than $41,000. I want to bring in a forensic accountant immediately to trace every transaction connected to your accounts over the past year. If your son did what I suspect he did, there's likely a much bigger pattern here than even you're currently aware of. She wasn't wrong. The forensic accountant, a meticulous, soft-spoken man named Arthur Kwan, spent the following 2 weeks combing through bank statements, property records, and transaction histories, and what he uncovered made the original $41,000 look almost quaint by comparison. Logan had, over the preceding 8 months, systematically drained nearly $312,000 from various accounts I held, some through direct transfers I'd unknowingly authorized via that power of attorney document, others through more elaborate schemes involving a shell consulting business he'd set up specifically to funnel money away from scrutiny. He'd taken out a second mortgage on my home using forged signatures Kwan was able to identify through inconsistencies in pen pressure and stroke patterns. He'd liquidated 2 retirement accounts. Eleanor and I had spent decades building accounts meant to be my security in exactly the kind of vulnerable old age I just survived against all odds. And worse, far worse than any of the financial details, Kwan found something in the cabin rental records that made my blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with mountain winters. Logan had rented that specific cabin, remote, decrepit, barely accessible by road, with a landlord who hadn't checked on the property in over a year. Specifically, deliberately, 4 months before our trip, paying cash, using a name that wasn't his own. He hadn't taken me up there on impulse. In a moment of panic over mounting debts, he couldn't manage any other way. He had planned my death 4 months in advance. I remember sitting in Diane Castellanos' office when she walked me through that particular finding, Marla's hand finding mine across the conference table without either of us quite acknowledging the gesture out loud, and feeling something inside me go very still and very cold, colder than anything that mountain had managed to do to me in 3 months of brutal winter. "He didn't just abandon you in a moment of weakness, Gideon," Diane said quietly, her usual brisk professionalism softening just slightly under the weight of what she'd just confirmed. "This was premeditated. He researched it. He planned it. He selected that location specifically because it offered him the highest probability of your death looking like a tragic accident rather than what it actually was." I want to tell you I had some dignified, composed response to that information. I didn't. I sat in that conference table chair and I wept, openly, the way I hadn't allowed myself to weep even during the worst nights on that mountain, because some part of me had still been holding on to the smallest, most foolish hope that what Logan did had been a crime of weakness rather than a crime of calculation. "What happens now?" I finally managed to ask, once I'd gathered enough composure to speak. Diane's expression hardened into something resolute, something that told me she'd handled cases like this before and knew exactly what came next. "Now," she said, "we go after him with everything the law allows. And Mr. Mercer, given what we've found, I believe everything the law allows is going to be considerably more than your son is prepared for." It was 2 days later that I learned Logan had no idea I was even alive. He'd been so confident in his planning, so certain that Cabin would finish what he'd started, that he'd continued moving forward with his life exactly as if I were already dead. Finalizing the sale of one of my hardware store locations through forged authority, meeting with an estate attorney to discuss formal probate proceedings on my presumed death, and according to information Kwan's investigation uncovered, actively house hunting for a property considerably more expensive than anything he could have afforded on his legitimate income. Diane suggested we use that ignorance to our advantage. "We're not going to confront him directly," she explained, laying out her strategy across that same conference table, Marla and Walter Briggs both present now. The 4 of us forming what felt like the first real team I'd had on my side since this entire nightmare began. "We're going to let him continue believing you're dead while we finish building an airtight case. And then, when we're ready, we're going to let him walk directly into the consequences of every single choice he's made, in front of every person who currently believes his version of this story." The plan was simple in its outline, but devastating in its execution. A final estate hearing, the kind Logan had already scheduled to formalize his claim on what remained of my assets, where every friend, business associate, and family acquaintance who'd been told I'd tragically wandered off and died would be gathered in one room. And I would walk into that room very much alive, with 3 months of survival behind me, with Marla Hayes as my witness, with Diane Castellanos' legal documentation in hand, and with Arthur Kwan's forensic accounting laying out in precise, undeniable detail exactly what my son had done. "It's going to be hard," Diane warned me, watching my face carefully. Walking in there, seeing his reaction, seeing the reactions of people who believed his lies for months. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the mountain, about 4 cans of beans and a hatchet and snares I'd half remembered from boyhood, about talking to Eleanor's photograph just to hear something resembling comfort in that freezing silence, about the vow I'd made to myself, out loud, to 4 cold walls, every single morning I refused to give up. "I survived 3 months in a wilderness my own son left me to die in," I said quietly. "I think I can survive watching his face when he realizes I didn't." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and as that week unfolded, I found myself in the strange position of preparing not for survival, but for confrontation. A different kind of fight than the one I'd just spent 3 months waging, but one that required every bit of the strength and clarity that Mountain had forced me to find within myself. Marla stayed by my side through all of it, her presence a constant reminder that I hadn't faced any of this alone, that the family I'd lost in Logan had somehow, in the strangest and most unlikely circumstances imaginable, been replaced by something I'd never expected to find. A fierce, steady loyalty from a woman who owed me nothing and had chosen to stand with me anyway. The night before the hearing, sitting in Walter's guest room with Eleanor's photograph propped on the nightstand beside me, I made myself one final promise, the same kind I'd made every cold morning on that mountain, except this time it wasn't about survival. I am not going to let him control this story anymore. Tomorrow, for the first time since that truck disappeared into the white horizon, I was finally going to control it myself. The morning of the hearing, I put on a suit Walter had loaned me, one that hung loose on my frame in ways my own suits never had before. The mountain took 40 pounds off a body that hadn't had much extra to spare in the first place. Marla fixed my collar in the hallway mirror with the same brisk efficiency she'd used to set broken kindling and dress frostbitten fingers, and for a moment, looking at our reflection together, I felt something steady itself in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel again. Something close to readiness. "You don't have to say much," Diane Castellanos reminded me as we drove toward the county building where the estate hearing had been scheduled. "Let the documentation speak. Let Kwan's findings speak. You just need to be present, alive, and willing to answer questions when asked. The facts will do the rest of the work." "I know," I said, though some part of me, some old stubborn part that had spent 72 years believing in confronting things head-on, wanted nothing more than to walk into that room and say every furious word that had been building in my chest since that truck disappeared into the white horizon. "I know. I'll let the facts speak." The county building's main hearing room was already half full when we arrived, and I made myself stand in the hallway outside for a long moment, gathering whatever composure the mountain had taught me how to find, before stepping through that door. I recognized faces immediately. Carl Dunmore, my old business partner from the second hardware store location, looking somber in a dark suit. Janet Whitfield, who'd been Eleanor's closest friend for 30 years, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue like she was already grieving. And there, at the front of the room, standing beside a long table with an estate attorney I didn't recognize, was Logan. He looked good, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the duffel bag of summer clothes he'd packed for my mountain winter. He was smiling, faintly, the practiced somber smile of a grieving son who'd nonetheless found a way to carry himself with dignity through tragedy. And seeing that smile, after everything, after 3 months of beans and rabbit snares and frostbite, and a woman named Marla who'd believed in me when nobody else could, something in my chest went hard and cold and absolutely certain. I walked into that room. I don't know exactly how to describe the sound a room makes when 50 people simultaneously realize the dead man they've gathered to mourn is standing in the doorway, very much alive. It wasn't a gasp exactly, not unified enough for that. It was more like a wave, starting near the front where Logan stood and rolling backward through the gathered crowd, voices rising in confused, overlapping fragments. Is that? I thought he. Oh my God! Gideon! But I wasn't watching the crowd. I was watching Logan. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time, watched his practiced, somber smile collapse into something raw and unguarded, watched 4 months of careful planning shatter across his features in the space of about 3 seconds. For just a moment, just one brief, unguarded moment before he managed to recompose himself, I saw something in my son's eyes that I will carry with me for the rest of whatever years I have left. He looked at me the way you look at a problem you thought you'd solved. Dad? His voice came out strangled, pitched higher than I'd ever heard it. Dad? Oh my God, you're alive! He moved toward me, arms outstretched like he meant to embrace me. And I want you to understand something about that moment, because I think it matters more than almost anything else I've told you. Some old, broken, hopeful part of me, the same part that had waved at that disappearing truck 3 months earlier, almost let him. Almost stepped into that hug and let it be real, let it be relief instead of performance, because some wounds in a parent's heart never fully close no matter what evidence sits in your hand. I stepped back instead. Don't, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Don't touch me, Logan. The room went absolutely silent. Dad, what? Logan's voice cracked, his eyes darting around the room, suddenly aware of every set of eyes watching this collision unfold. What's going on? We've been searching for you for months. You thought I was dead, I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Because you left me in a cabin you rented 4 months in advance, under a false name, paid for in cash, with 4 days of food and summer clothing for a mountain winter. You thought I was dead because that's exactly what you planned. The wave of murmurs that swept through the room this time was different from the first, sharper, more uncertain. People glancing between Logan and me like they were trying to recalibrate everything they thought they understood about the tragedy they'd gathered to formalize. Logan's face had gone pale, then flushed, anger and panic visibly warring across his features. That's insane, Dad. You're confused. You've been through a traumatic experience. You're not thinking clearly. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said, and I felt Marla step up beside me, steady and present, a wall of quiet support I hadn't realized how badly I needed until I felt her there. I have a forensic accountant who's traced $312,000 out of my accounts. I have cabin rental records with your handwriting on them, under a false name. I have a power of attorney document I signed without my reading glasses because my own son told me it was routine paperwork. None of that is confusion, Logan. That's evidence. Dad, please. His voice had dropped, pleading now, and I watched him glance around the room, gauging how many witnesses were absorbing every word, recalculating his strategy in real time, the way I imagined he'd been calculating things for months. Can we talk about this privately? This isn't the place. This is exactly the place. Diane Castellanos stepped forward now, her voice cutting through the room with the calm, devastating precision of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. This hearing was scheduled to formalize your claim on your father's estate based on a presumed death you yourself reported, Mr. Mercer. Given that your father is very much alive, and given the evidence we've gathered regarding the circumstances of his disappearance, I think everyone in this room deserves to understand exactly what's been happening over these past several months. What followed was, I think, the most surreal hour of my entire life, more surreal even than the mountain itself, because the mountain had at least been honest in its cruelty. This was something else, watching my own son's carefully constructed life unravel in real time, in front of every person who'd believed his lies, as Diane laid out the evidence piece by methodical piece. The power of attorney document, obtained through what Diane characterized as deceptive means, given that I'd been told it was routine paperwork rather than a transfer of significant financial authority. The $41,000 I'd given him for his contracting business, which forensic tracing showed had never actually been invested in any legitimate business expansion. The cabin rental, paid in cash under a false name 4 months before our trip, a detail that landed across the room like a physical blow, several people actually gasping audibly when Diane read the date aloud. 4 months. Janet Whitfield said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room, staring at Logan with an expression of dawning horror. You planned this 4 months ago? While you were still coming to Eleanor's memorial dinners with us, talking about how much you missed your father? Logan's face had gone through so many transformations by this point, panic, pleading, anger, that I almost didn't recognize the expression settling over it now. Something cold, something that looked, for the first time since I'd walked into that room, less like a son caught in a terrible mistake and more like a man who'd simply run out of useful lies. You don't understand what it's been like, he said, and his voice had changed too, the pleading edge replaced with something harder, almost resentful. Watching him build that business, watching him give everything to those stores, while I struggled for years trying to get my own thing off the ground. He had 4 locations, Dad. 4. And I couldn't even keep one contracting crew employed through a winter. So your solution was to kill me? The words came out of me flat, almost calm, though my hands were shaking at my sides. Instead of asking for help honestly, instead of admitting your business was struggling, you decided the easier path was to drain my accounts and leave me to freeze to death in a cabin you researched and rented months in advance. I didn't think you'd actually... He stopped himself, but it was too late, the words already hanging in the air between us, an admission no amount of backtracking could erase. The room had gone utterly silent now, 50 people absorbing the moment my son nearly confessed, in front of all of them, that he had genuinely expected the mountain to finish what he'd started. You didn't think I'd actually what, Logan? I pressed, my voice rising now despite every effort to stay measured. Survive? Is that what you were about to say? You didn't think I'd actually survive? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him, complete and damning, and I watched understanding ripple through the gathered crowd as 50 years of relationships, business partnerships, friendships, the entire social fabric that had surrounded my family for decades, recalibrated in real time around the truth of what my son actually was. Carl Dunmore was the first to speak into that silence, his voice rough with something between anger and disbelief. Logan, I helped you get your first contracting permits. I vouched for you with 3 different suppliers. Are you telling this room you tried to murder your own father for money? It wasn't... Logan's composure was fully gone now, his hands gesturing helplessly, his eyes darting between faces that had clearly already made up their minds about what they were witnessing. It wasn't supposed to be like that. I thought he'd find help. I thought someone would find him before what, Mr. Mercer? Diane's voice cut in, cold and precise. Before the food ran out? Before hypothermia set in? You rented an isolated cabin specifically because it offered minimal probability of rescue. Our investigation has confirmed that property hadn't been checked by its owner in over 14 months prior to your father's stay there. You didn't hope someone would find him. You selected a location specifically designed to ensure no one would. The legal proceedings that followed over the subsequent weeks moved with a speed that almost startled me, given how slowly my own survival had unfolded on that mountain. Once the estate hearing had effectively become a public unraveling of Logan's scheme, the county prosecutor's office moved quickly to file formal charges: elder financial abuse, fraud, and what the district attorney eventually characterized, after reviewing Kwan's full forensic accounting and the cabin rental records, as attempted manslaughter through deliberate premeditated abandonment. I won't pretend the months that followed were anything close to easy. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after the adrenaline of confrontation fades, when you're left simply sitting in deposition rooms and attorneys' offices, recounting the same painful details over and over to investigators, insurance representatives, court officials, each retelling peeling back a little more of the protective scar tissue I'd built up, just to survive the original experience. Marla stayed through all of it. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. She had no legal obligation to remain involved in my case once we'd reached civilization, no biological tie, no financial stake in the outcome. She stayed because, somewhere on that mountain, in a cave with a hunting knife and a careful, hard-won wariness toward trusting anyone, she'd decided I was worth standing beside anyway. That kind of loyalty, freely given with nothing to gain, taught me more about what family actually means than 72 years of believing blood automatically guaranteed it. "You keep thanking me," she said one evening, several weeks into the legal proceedings, the two of us sharing a quiet dinner at Walter's kitchen table while paperwork from Diane's office sat stacked between us. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Gideon. I'm not doing this because I expect gratitude." "Then why do you keep doing it?" I asked, genuinely curious, because I'd spent my whole life believing people's kindness usually came with some expectation attached, even if they never said so directly. She considered the question for a long moment, turning her water glass slowly on the table. "Because somewhere up on that mountain, surviving alongside you, I remembered what it felt like to actually matter to someone," she said finally. "My husband spent 22 years making sure I never felt that way. You've spent 3 months treating me like an equal, like someone whose opinion and effort actually counted for something. That's not nothing, Gideon. That's not something I take lightly after the life I came from." I didn't have an adequate response to that, so I simply reached across the table and squeezed her hand, the same hand that had set my snares and bandaged my frostbitten fingers and pulled me back from the edge of giving up more times than either of us probably wanted to fully count. The criminal trial, when it finally came, lasted 9 days. I testified for 2 of them, walking the courtroom through every detail of those 3 months. The dwindling food supply, the green pine that wouldn't catch fire properly, the talking to Eleanor's photograph just to hear something resembling comfort. The moment I found Marla's careful, deliberate footprints in the snow and felt hope for the first time in 3 weeks. I watched several jurors wipe their eyes during that testimony, and I'll admit there was a particular satisfaction in that, not cruel exactly, but the satisfaction of finally being believed after months of being someone else's convenient, tragic story. Logan's defense attorney tried several angles over those 9 days, arguing financial desperation as mitigation, suggesting I'd somehow misunderstood the nature of the power of attorney document, even attempting briefly to suggest that I'd chosen to stay at that cabin longer than necessary out of some kind of stubborn pride rather than genuine helplessness. That last argument fell apart spectacularly under Marla's cross-examination, where she calmly, clinically detailed the medical realities of the frostbite and malnutrition she'd documented when she first found me, conditions entirely inconsistent with someone choosing to remain in those circumstances by preference. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: elder financial abuse, fraud, and attempted manslaughter through deliberate criminal negligence. I sat in that courtroom, Marla on one side and Walter Briggs on the other, and I watched my son's face as the verdict was read, watched the last of whatever composure he'd maintained throughout the trial finally crumble entirely. He turned to look at me, just once, before the bailiffs led him away for sentencing to be scheduled. I don't know what I expected to see in that final look. Remorse, maybe, or at least some flicker of the boy I'd taught to fish at Cobb Lake, the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on the long drive home. What I saw instead was something closer to resentment. Like even now, even after everything, some part of him still believed I'd wronged him somehow by simply surviving what he'd planned. That look told me something important, something I needed to fully accept before I could move forward with whatever life came next. There was no redemption story waiting in my son, no deeply buried good version of him that circumstances had corrupted and that punishment might somehow restore. Logan had made a series of deliberate choices, sustained over months of careful planning, and even facing the full consequences of those choices, he still couldn't locate genuine remorse for what he'd done to me. The sentencing came 3 weeks later, 22 years, with the possibility of parole after 14, the judge citing both the premeditated nature of the crime and the particular cruelty of exploiting a parent's trust as aggravating factors in her decision. I sat in that courtroom one final time, listening to that number, and felt something complicated settle in my chest. Not joy, exactly, because there's no real joy in watching your own child sentenced to prison, but something closer to closure, the particular relief of a story finally, fully resolved rather than left hanging in painful, unresolved uncertainty. Walking out of that courthouse for the last time, into ordinary afternoon sunlight that felt almost unreal after everything we'd survived, Marla fell into step beside me, quiet, steady, present in the way she'd been present through every single difficult moment since that day she'd found my footprints near her cave. "What now?" she asked, and I could hear in her voice that she wasn't just asking about the immediate plan for the afternoon. She was asking about everything, about what a man does with the remaining years of his life after surviving exactly the kind of betrayal that should, by all reasonable measure, have killed him. I thought about the mountain, about that collapsing cabin that had nearly become my grave, about the strange, unlikely gift of finding a woman in a cave who taught me more about real loyalty in 3 months than I'd learned in 72 years of believing family meant something automatic, something guaranteed by blood, rather than earned through actual choice and actual care. I think, I said slowly, an idea forming even as I spoke it aloud for the first time, I'm not done with that mountain yet. Marla looked at me like I'd lost what little sense the mountain had left me with. You want to go back? She asked, stopping mid-step on the courthouse sidewalk. Afternoon traffic rumbling past us like the world hadn't just rearranged itself completely around the verdict we'd left inside that building. Gideon, that place nearly killed you. That place nearly became my grave because of what Logan made it, I said, and the idea was sharpening now, taking shape with each word I spoke aloud. But it didn't kill me. I survived it. We survived it. I keep thinking about that cabin, and I keep thinking about how it was supposed to be the end of my story. And instead it became the place I found you, the place I found out exactly how strong I still was at 72 years old. I don't want to leave it sitting up there as a monument to what my son tried to do to me. I want it to mean something else. Marla studied my face for a long moment, and I watched the wariness in her expression slowly give way to something like understanding, the same recognition that had passed between us that first day in the cave when two wounded strangers decided, against every instinct toward self-protection, to trust each other. What did you have in mind? She asked. What I had in mind, as it turned out, took the better part of a year to fully realize, and I want to tell you honestly that the road there wasn't smooth or simple, because nothing about real recovery ever is, no matter how satisfying a clean, tidy ending might sound to someone listening to this story from the comfort of their own warm home. There was the matter of my finances first, which Diane Castellanos and Arthur Kwan spent months helping me untangle and recover. We managed to claw back roughly $210,000 of the $312,000 Logan had stolen through asset seizure and restitution orders the court attached to his sentencing. The rest, Diane told me with the kind of weary honesty I'd come to appreciate from her, was likely gone for good, spent on the truck, the house he'd been planning to buy, a lifestyle built on money that was never actually his to spend. I won't pretend that didn't sting. A man doesn't build 4 hardware stores out of nothing without understanding exactly what $100,000 represents in terms of hours worked and risks taken. But I'd learned something on that mountain that no amount of money could have taught me any other way. That there's a difference between what you lose and what actually breaks you, and Logan had only managed the first of those, never the second. There was also the matter of rebuilding myself physically, which took longer than I expected and humbled me more than I'd anticipated. The frostbite damage to my hand required 2 surgeries and months of physical therapy before I regained anything close to full function in those 3 affected fingers. The malnutrition had done damage to my heart that a cardiologist informed me with the same blunt clinical honesty Dr. Reyes had shown back at that mountain clinic, meant I needed to take my recovery seriously rather than simply willing myself back to full strength through stubbornness alone, the way I'd willed myself through every freezing night on that mountain. You can't survive your way through cardiac rehabilitation, Gideon, Marla told me firmly, more than once, during the months I spent grumbling through supervised exercise programs and dietary restrictions that felt, after months of starvation, almost insulting in their caution. You fought hard enough to get here. Don't undo it now by being too proud to actually heal properly. She was right, of course. She usually was, and I'd learned over our months together that arguing with her on matters of health and survival was an exercise in futility that only delayed the inevitable moment I'd admit she'd been correct all along. It was during those months of recovery, sitting together most evenings at the small house I'd purchased after selling what remained of my hardware store holdings, I decided, after everything, that I no longer had the energy or the desire to rebuild that particular empire, not after watching how easily greed for what I'd built had corrupted my own son, that Marla and I started talking seriously about her daughter. You should reach out to her, I told her one evening. the conversation arriving naturally out of months of slowly accumulated trust between us. I know you're scared of what you might find. I understand that fear better now than I ever did before. But you spent 8 years assuming the worst about how she'd react, the same way I spent 3 months assuming the worst about whether I'd survive. Sometimes the only way to know the truth is to actually face it, instead of just bracing against it. It took her another 2 months to work up the courage, and when she finally did write that letter, carefully, painstakingly, revising it more times than either of us could count, the response that came back wasn't the rejection she'd spent 8 years dreading. Her daughter, a young woman named Olivia, who'd apparently spent years quietly suspecting her father's version of events didn't add up, wrote back within a week, and within a month, mother and daughter were sitting together at my kitchen table, both of them crying in the particular complicated way that comes from grief finally given permission to resolve itself. I tell you about Olivia not because her story is the center of this one, but because I think it matters, in a story about family and betrayal and what people owe each other, to show you that not every family story ends in devastation. Some end in repair, slow and imperfect, and hard-won, but real. Watching Marla rebuild that relationship with her daughter, after everything her husband had stolen from her, including 8 years of a mother-daughter bond she'd believed permanently broken, taught me something important about the difference between blood relationships and chosen ones. That family, real family, isn't actually about who shares your last name. It's about who shows up, who tells the truth even when it's hard, who chooses you again and again, rather than simply expecting loyalty as some kind of automatic birthright. It was almost exactly a year after that truck disappeared into the white horizon that I finally made the drive back up to that mountain, this time with Marla beside me, this time in a truck I'd purchased myself with money that was unquestionably mine, this time carrying tools and lumber and supplies instead of a duffel bag packed wrong on purpose. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, the way places from our worst memories often do once we've survived them and gained some distance. The roof was still half collapsed, the windows still grimed with a year's additional weather, but standing there in front of it, Marla's hand finding mine the way it had so many times over the preceding months, I didn't feel the cold dread I'd half expected. I felt something closer to ownership, the strange, hard-won sense that this place, this structure that had been built specifically to be my grave, was now entirely mine to remake into whatever I chose. "We're really doing this," Marla said, not quite a question, looking up at that ruined roofline with an expression that mixed practical assessment with something more emotional underneath it. "We're really doing this," I confirmed. The restoration took the better part of 8 months, slowed by mountain weather and my own recovering body, but accelerated considerably by a small crew of local contractors I hired. Honest men this time, vetted thoroughly through Diane's office and Walter's network of trusted business contacts, because I'd learned, perhaps the hardest way a man can learn anything, exactly how much damage misplaced trust can do. We rebuilt the roof first, then the walls, insulating properly this time, installing a generator and solar panels so the place would never again be the kind of structure where someone could simply leave a person to freeze without consequence. We added a second cabin nearby, then a third, small but comfortable, each one built with exactly the kind of careful, deliberate craftsmanship that stood in direct, defiant contrast to the careless cruelty of how that original cabin had been used against me. I named the place Eleanor's Rest, after my late wife, and I'll admit that decision came with its own particular grief, because some part of me kept thinking about how she would have handled all of this, how her steady, practical wisdom might have guided me through both the original betrayal and the long road back from it. I think she would have approved of what we eventually built up there, though. I think she would have understood, better than almost anyone, exactly why it mattered to me. Eleanor's Rest opened to its first guests the following winter, a winter shelter and respite retreat specifically for stranded travelers, but more particularly, more purposefully, for seniors who'd survived their own versions of hardship and betrayal and simply needed somewhere safe to rebuild, free of charge for anyone who couldn't afford to pay. Sustained by a small foundation Diane helped me establish using the recovered restitution funds and a portion of what remained from selling my hardware stores. I think about that first winter often, watching strangers arrive at that cabin's door, some of them fleeing situations not so different from my own. Adult children who'd decided an aging parent's assets mattered more than their well-being, financial predators who'd targeted vulnerable elderly people through schemes far more common than I'd ever understood before living through one myself. I sat with each of them when they were ready to talk, and I told them honestly what I'd learned on that mountain, the hardest, truest lesson of my entire 73 years of living by that point. Love that requires you to surrender your dignity, your autonomy, your right to protect what you've built across a lifetime of hard work was never actually love to begin with. It was just theft wearing a familiar, trusted face. You're not required to give everything away just because someone shares your blood, I told an elderly woman named Patricia, who arrived at Eleanor's Rest that first winter, fleeing a son who'd been systematically pressuring her to sign over her house, using exactly the kind of emotional manipulation Logan had once used on me. You spent your whole life building what you have. You have every right to protect it, to set boundaries, to say no, even to people you love. Especially to people you love sometimes, because love shouldn't require you to disappear. She cried when I told her that. The particular relief of finally hearing permission from someone who'd lived through exactly what she was currently facing, and I understood, watching her, exactly why I'd needed to build this place. Not for revenge against Logan, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in transforming his intended murder weapon into a sanctuary for people exactly like the person he'd tried to destroy. I built it because surviving something terrible means nothing, ultimately, if you don't use what you survived to help someone else survive their own version of it. Marla and I never married, for what it's worth, though I know some people who hear this story expect that particular ending, the neat romantic bow tied over everything that happened to us. What we built instead was something I think mattered more than romance, something steadier and more deliberate. Partnership, chosen daily, built on the kind of trust that doesn't come automatically through blood or vows, but through actually surviving something together and choosing, every single day afterward, to keep showing up for each other. She ran the medical side of Eleanor's Rest, training a small staff in wilderness first aid and trauma-informed care for the elderly guests who arrived, often carrying wounds far less visible than frostbite but no less real. Logan, I should tell you, wrote to me twice from prison during that first year of construction. I read both letters, and I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated reading them, some old, stubborn parental instinct that wanted desperately to find genuine remorse in his words rather than what I actually found. Careful, calculated apologies that always seemed to circle back, eventually, to requests for reduced sentencing, character references, anything that might shorten his time behind bars. I didn't respond to either letter. I'm not proud of how much that decision still costs me some nights. The particular grief of a parent who has to accept that loving someone and protecting yourself from them aren't always compatible choices. But I'd learned, on that mountain and in the year that followed it, that protecting my own dignity sometimes meant accepting losses that never fully stop aching, even when accepting them is unquestionably the right decision. Eleanor's Rest has been open for going on 4 years now, as I sit here telling you this story. We've sheltered over 200 guests in that time. Stranded hikers caught in unexpected storms, yes, but mostly, overwhelmingly, elderly people who'd survived exactly the kind of betrayal I survived, who needed somewhere safe to land while they rebuilt their finances, their legal standing, their simple belief that the world still contained people willing to show up for them without expecting something in return. I think about that fourth night on the mountain often, the night I finally let myself say the word abandoned out loud for the first time, sitting beside a dying fire with shaking hands and a hatchet I barely knew how to use. I think about how certain I was, in that moment, that my story was ending in exactly the way Logan had planned it. I think about how wrong I turned out to be, not because the mountain became easier, but because I refused to let it finish what my own son had started. If you've made it this far with me, through 3 months of frozen wilderness and a courtroom verdict and a year spent rebuilding both a cabin and a life, I want to leave you with something more than just the satisfaction of watching Logan face consequences for what he did. I want to leave you with the thing that Mountain taught me, the thing I now spend my days teaching to every frightened, betrayed elderly guest who arrives at Eleanor's Rest looking for somewhere safe to finally exhale. Your worth was never tied to what you can give away. Your dignity is not a negotiating chip that family gets to demand in exchange for their continued presence in your life. If someone, anyone, including the children you raised, including the people you trusted most completely in this world, shows you, through their actions rather than their words, that they value what you have more than they value who you are. You are allowed to protect yourself from them. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed at 72 or 82 or any age in between to build boundaries around what's yours and defend them with everything you've got left. I survived a mountain my own son built specifically to be my grave. I survived it not because I was stronger than the cold, though I suppose, in the end, I was. I survived it because somewhere underneath 72 years of believing love required unconditional sacrifice, I found a harder, truer kind of love, the kind that demands you protect yourself first, so that you have something left to actually give the people who deserve it. Logan became, in the end, exactly what Diane warned me he might become if I let him keep controlling the narrative. A painful, distant chapter in a much longer story, rather than the ending he'd planned for me. And Eleanor's Rest, the place built to be my grave, became instead the truest legacy I think I'll ever leave behind, far more meaningful than 4 hardware stores ever were. I'm 76 years old now, sitting by a fire that warms instead of barely sustains, in a cabin that shelters instead of threatens, surrounded by a family I chose rather than one I was simply born into. And if there's one thing I hope you carry away from everything I've told you tonight, it's this. It is never too late to reclaim your own story, no matter how thoroughly someone else has tried to write its ending for you. I named the place Eleanor's Rest, after my late wife, and I'll admit that decision came with its own particular grief, because some part of me kept thinking about how she would have handled all of this, how her steady practical wisdom might have guided me through both the original betrayal and the long road back from it. I think she would have approved of what we eventually built up there, though. I think she would have understood better than almost anyone exactly why it mattered to me. Eleanor's Rest opened to its first guests the following winter, a winter shelter and respite retreat specifically for stranded travelers, but more particularly, more purposefully, for seniors who'd survived their own versions of hardship and betrayal and simply needed somewhere safe to rebuild, free of charge for anyone who couldn't afford to pay, sustained by a small foundation Diane helped me establish using the recovered restitution funds and a portion of what remained from selling my hardware stores. I think about that first winter often, watching strangers arrive at that cabin's door, some of them fleeing situations not so different from my own. Adult children who'd decided an aging parent's assets mattered more than their well-being, financial predators who targeted vulnerable elderly people through schemes far more common than I'd ever understood before living through one myself. I sat with each of them when they were ready to talk, and I told them honestly what I'd learned on that mountain, the hardest, truest lesson of my entire 73 years of living by that point. Love that requires you to surrender your dignity, your autonomy, your right to protect what you've built across a lifetime of hard work was never actually love to begin with. It was just theft wearing a familiar, trusted face. You're not required to give everything away just because someone shares your blood, I told an elderly woman named Patricia who arrived at Eleanor's Rest that first winter, fleeing a son who'd been systematically pressuring her to sign over her house, using exactly the kind of emotional manipulation Logan had once used on me. You spent your whole life building what you have. You have every right to protect it, to set boundaries, to say no, even to people you love. Especially to people you love sometimes, because love shouldn't require you to disappear. She cried when I told her that. The particular relief of finally hearing permission from someone who'd lived through exactly what she was currently facing, and I understood, watching her, exactly why I'd needed to build this place. Not for revenge against Logan, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in transforming his intended murder weapon into a sanctuary for people exactly like the person he'd tried to destroy. I built it because surviving something terrible means nothing, ultimately, if you don't use what you survived to help someone else survive their own version of it. Marla and I never married, for what it's worth, though I know some people who hear this story expect that particular ending, the neat romantic bow tied over everything that happened to us. What we built instead was something I think mattered more than romance, something steadier and more deliberate, partnership. Chosen daily, built on the kind of trust that doesn't come automatically through blood or vows, but through actually surviving something together and choosing every single day afterward to keep showing up for each other. She ran the medical side of Eleanor's Rest, training a small staff in wilderness first aid and trauma-informed care for the elderly guests who arrived, often carrying wounds far less visible than frostbite, but no less real. Logan, I should tell you, wrote to me twice from prison during that first year of construction. I read both letters, and I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated reading them, some old, stubborn parental instinct that wanted desperately to find genuine remorse in his words, rather than what I actually found. Careful, calculated apologies that always seemed to circle back, eventually, to requests for reduced sentencing, character references, anything that might shorten his time behind bars. I didn't respond to either letter. I'm not proud of how much that decision still costs me some nights. The particular grief of a parent who has to accept that loving someone and protecting yourself from them aren't always compatible choices. But I'd learned, on that mountain and in the year that followed it, that protecting my own dignity sometimes meant accepting losses that never fully stop aching, even when accepting them is unquestionably the right decision. Eleanor's Rest has been open for going on 4 years now, as I sit here telling you this story. We've sheltered over 200 guests in that time. Stranded hikers caught in unexpected storms, yes, but mostly, overwhelmingly, elderly people who'd survived exactly the kind of betrayal I survived, who needed somewhere safe to land while they rebuilt their finances, their legal standing, their simple belief that the world still contained people willing to show up for them without expecting something in return. I think about that fourth night on the mountain often, the night I finally let myself say the word abandoned out loud for the first time, sitting beside a dying fire with shaking hands and a hatchet I barely knew how to use. I think about how certain I was, in that moment, that my story was ending in exactly the way Logan had planned it. I think about how wrong I turned out to be, not because the mountain became easier, but because I refused to let it finish what my own son had started. If you've made it this far with me, through 3 months of frozen wilderness and a courtroom verdict, and a year spent rebuilding both a cabin and a life, I want to leave you with something more than just the satisfaction of watching Logan face consequences for what he did. I want to leave you with the thing that Mountain taught me, the thing I now spend my days teaching to every frightened, betrayed elderly guest who arrives at Eleanor's Rest looking for somewhere safe to finally exhale. Your worth was never tied to what you can give away. Your dignity is not a negotiating chip that family gets to demand in exchange for their continued presence in your life. If anyone, including the children you raised, including the people you trusted most completely in this world, shows you through their actions rather than their words that they value what you have more than they value who you are, you are allowed to protect yourself from them. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed at 72 or 82 or any age in between to build boundaries around what's yours and defend them with everything you've got left. I survived a mountain my own son built specifically to be my grave. I survived it not because I was stronger than the cold, though I suppose, in the end, I was. I survived it because somewhere underneath 72 years of believing love required unconditional sacrifice, I found a harder, truer kind of love. The kind that demands you protect yourself first, so that you have something left to actually give the people who deserve it. Logan became, in the end, exactly what Diane warned me he might become if I let him keep controlling the narrative. A painful, distant chapter in a much longer story, rather than the ending he'd planned for me. And Eleanor's Rest, the place built to be my grave, became instead the truest legacy I think I'll ever leave behind. Far more meaningful than 4 hardware stores ever were. I'm 76 years old now, sitting by a fire that warms instead of barely sustains, in a cabin that shelters instead of threatens, surrounded by a family I chose rather than one I was simply born into. And if there's one thing I hope you carry away from everything I've told you tonight, it's this. It is never too late to reclaim your own story, no matter how thoroughly someone else has tried to write its ending for you.